The first time I smelled bacon and wet grass in Texas, I thought I was dead. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka's voice trembles as he recalls that morning in 1944. He had expected the metallic stench of blood, the echo of gunfire, the slow humiliation of captivity. Instead, there was only the smell of smoke from a ranch cooker and the soft, impossible sound of laughter. He opened his eyes to sunlight spilling over the endless Texas plains. The war had brought him across an ocean. But this was not war. He blinked against the light, realizing the guards standing nearby weren't holding rifles, they were holding coffee mugs. Tanaka tried to speak, but his throat was raw. One of the guards, a young man with a tanned face and the relaxed confidence of someone who'd never seen Tokyo, walked over and offered him something. A hat. Keep the sun off, the Texan said simply. Tanaka hesitated, glancing between the sasson and the man's calm expression. In Japan, surrender was shame, mercy was weakness. But here, in this strange land of open skies and wider hearts, mercy seemed to have muscle. He took the hat. The cowboy grinned. Welcome to Texas, Lieutenant. The moment passed in silence, broken only by the distant call of cattle. Tanaka's mind reeled. He was a pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy, trained to die, not to live among enemies. His last memory before being captured was watching the Pacific horizon burn red with the wreckage of his aircraft. And now he stood under the same sun as his captors, breathing the same air, wearing a cowboy's hat. As he walked toward the waiting truck, he noticed something strange. The guards didn't shout, they didn't bark orders, they spoke to each other the way old friends might on a long workday. Even when they looked at him at the enemy, their eyes weren't filled with hatred. Tanaka had been taught that Americans were barbarians, demons who laughed while torturing prisoners. Yet these men laughed without cruelty. They looked more like farmers than soldiers. Their rifles hung loose at their sides, almost as if forgotten. He climbed into the truck with a dozen other captured airmen. The vehicle rattled down a dirt road that stretched endlessly across the prairie. The fences ran to the horizon, cutting through golden grass that glowed under the morning sun. "This is America," one of the PS whispered in disbelief. "No cities, no smoke, just freedom." Another muttered, "Freedom? We're prisoners." Tanaka looked at the open landscape and said softly, "Then why does it feel like the world got bigger?" Hours later, the truck arrived, not at a prison, but at what looked like a farm. Wooden barns, corrals, and men in denim waiting by the fence. A sign read, U.S. Army Cattle Division, P Labor Unit. The air smelled of hay and bacon fat. A ranch cook was frying breakfast on a cast-iron skillet. Tanaka stepped off the truck, expecting orders to dig trenches or haul crates. Instead, a cowboy handed him gloves and pointed toward the fields. "You boys ever saddle up?" The PS looked confused. The cowboy smirked. "You're working with cattle today, don't worry, we'll teach you. No threats, no shouting, just work." As Tanaka pulled on the gloves, the absurdity hit him. The Empire had told him America was cruel and godless, but here the enemy was teaching him how to ride a horse. That night he wrote in his diary by flashlight, "They treat us not as beasts, but as men. I do not understand it yet, but perhaps I will." The narrator's voice fades in. In 1944, over 5,000 Japanese prisoners of war were held across Texas. They came expecting chains. Instead, they found cattle, open skies, and a kind of freedom they had never known. They told us Americans would skin us alive. Those were the last words Hiroshi Tanaka remembered hearing before being shipped out of the Pacific. His commander had spoken them with absolute certainty, the same certainty that had driven thousands of Japanese soldiers to die rather than surrender. To be captured, the officer warned, is worse than death. The propaganda was total. Every leaflet, every radio broadcast, every instructor hammered home the same message. Americans were monsters. They burned villages, desecrated the dead, and slaughtered prisoners for sport. Captivity was dishonor. Surrender was spiritual suicide. When Tanaka's plane was shot down over the Philippines, he had considered ending his life on the spot. His pistol jammed. Fate, or perhaps irony, intervened. American soldiers dragged him from the wreckage, half-conscious and bleeding. He braced for the end. An execution he'd been taught was certain. Instead, someone offered him morphine. Someone else pressed a canteen to his lips. One soldier even muttered, "Hang in there, pal." Pal? The word lodged in his brain like shrapnel. Days later, when Tanaka awoke in a hospital tent, clean and fed, he began to wonder whether everything he'd been told was a lie. But disbelief was easier than acceptance. He told himself this must be psychological warfare, that the Americans were playing a trick. When they shipped him to the mainland aboard a Liberty ship, that paranoia deepened. The voyage across the Pacific was long, filled with questions and silence. The PS huddled together, whispering about what awaited them. "They'll humiliate us," one said, "make us work in the mines." Another spat bitterly. Better to drown than be a slave. But when they arrived in San Francisco, the docks weren't lined with jeering mobs. They saw dock workers, soldiers, nurses, ordinary people, tired but unafraid. The guards didn't wear expressions of vengeance. They were efficient, calm, almost bored. Tanaka noted in his journal, "Their discipline is not from fear, it is natural." The train journey to Texas was surreal. As they crossed the wide American plains, Tanaka pressed his forehead to the window glass. He saw nothing of the bombed-out wastelands he expected, just green fields, water towers, small towns. Everywhere, life was abundant. Children waved as the P-train passed. He had never seen such confidence in a people. Japan's soldiers fought for survival. America's citizens lived as if war couldn't touch them. When the train finally stopped at Camp Huntsville, the PS were marched out beneath a flag so large it seemed to swallow the sky. A captain read from a paper, "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated humanely. You will not be harmed." Tanaka's interpreter whispered the translation. The men looked at each other confused. It sounded too good to be true. They were given soap, uniforms and bedding. The camp had running water, a medical ward, even a library. No one screamed orders, no one beat them. One evening, Tanaka saw an American sergeant sitting by a fence cleaning his rifle while listening to a small radio. A swing song played softly, something cheerful, utterly out of place in wartime. Tanaka couldn't help but listen. The sergeant looked up and said, "You like music?" Tanaka hesitated. "In Japan," he answered carefully, "we listen to marches." The sergeant grinned. "Then you're going to love Texas." For the first time since his capture, Tanaka felt something strange, curiosity, not fear. He realized that these Americans didn't see themselves as gods or devils. They were just men who believed mercy didn't weaken them. It defined them. That night he wrote in his diary, "They do not conquer through cruelty. They conquer through confidence." By 1944, the United States had built the largest prisoner of war network in modern history. Across the American South and Midwest, over 400 camps housed nearly 500,000 Axis prisoners, Germans, Italians, and a few thousand Japanese. Texas alone held more than 70,000 men spread across the plains far from coastal cities or military secrets. The system was vast, disciplined, and astonishingly humane. Camp commanders operated under the Geneva Convention's full letter. Each prisoner received medical care, clothing, and 3 meals a day. Conditions that astonished men like Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, who had imagined America as a land of vengeance. The Texas facilities weren't fortresses of steel and stone. They were orderly grids of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and mesquite trees. The heat was brutal, but the freedom inside the fences felt strange. Every camp had structure and purpose. PS rose at dawn, saluted their officers, and ate breakfast prepared by army cooks. Work assignments rotated: agriculture, maintenance, carpentry. They could earn small wages, spend them in a camp canteen, or save them for repatriation. Some men painted, others studied English. The Americans didn't seek to punish, they sought to occupy idle minds. What surprised Tanaka most was how little fear the guards displayed. Most were young Texans and Midwestern farm boys, confident, easygoing and unthreatened. Their orders were simple: treat the prisoners as soldiers, not criminals. There were rules, yes, but few insults. The Americans didn't have to shout to command respect. Their calm authority came from certainty, not rage. The government saw value in these camps beyond containment. America's war economy needed labor, with millions of men fighting overseas. Farms and factories faced critical shortages. Under the War Manpower Commission, the Army authorized PSWs to work for civilian contractors, especially in agriculture. In Texas, that meant ranches, cotton fields, and cattle drives. The arrangement benefited everyone. The ranchers got reliable labor. The Army reduced the cost of feeding idle prisoners, and the PS earned privileges that made captivity bearable. In 1944 alone, PSWs across Texas produced millions of pounds of crops and beef for the war effort, an ironic twist in which former enemies kept Allied soldiers fed. Tanaka and his group were selected for one such program near San Angelo. The Japanese prisoners were a curiosity. Most locals had only seen depictions of them in propaganda posters. Some ranchers hesitated at first, but the Army guaranteed security and discipline. The cowboys who worked alongside them soon realized that these men, though foreign, were just as human, just as weary of the endless war. In official records, Camp Borden's work program logged over 20,000 labor hours in its first 3 months. Incidents of escape or defiance were almost non-existent. For men like Tanaka, labor under the open sky felt strangely like freedom. The Americans trusted them with tools, with animals, even with the land itself. At night, the PS sat in barracks built from pine planks, listening to crickets outside instead of gunfire. Some drew sketches of cattle and sunsets to send home through Red Cross mail. Tanaka found himself writing less about fear and more about curiosity. He began to record small details. The way the cowboys spoke in long, slow vowels, the way the ranch dogs guarded them without hostility, and the way no one seemed to doubt tomorrow. To Tanaka, that was America's quiet power. This unshakable faith that life would continue even in war. In a country where even prisoners could find purpose, defeat began to look less like humiliation and more like a strange kind of awakening. When Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka first saw Camp Borden, he expected barbed wire barking guards and the cold weight of humiliation. Instead, he saw dust, sunlight, and an American flag flapping lazily over a field of mesquite and wildflowers. The compound stretched across the Texas prairie, simple wooden barracks, mess halls, a chapel, and even a small baseball diamond. The fences were high, but the horizon seemed higher. As the trucks rolled to a stop, a sergeant waved them out. "Form 2 lines," he called, his tone calm but firm. The prisoners obeyed. Tanaka noticed something strange. The guards' rifles were slung casually, not aimed. No one shouted. There were no snarling dogs or threats. The Americans worked efficiently, recording names, issuing numbers, handing out fresh uniforms stamped PW. Each man was given a bar of soap, a towel, and a tin cup. Small objects, but clean, practical, and new. Inside the barracks, sunlight filtered through open windows. The air smelled faintly of pine, not sweat or decay. Rows of bunks stood neatly with folded blankets. A water spigot provided clean drinking water, a luxury unimaginable in most Pacific outposts. Tanaka touched the metal faucet, half expecting it to vanish. "They built this for prisoners," he whispered. That evening, dinner was served in the mess hall. The meal, meatloaf, potatoes, bread, and coffee, was simple but warm. One of the men refused to eat, muttering that the food must be poisoned. Another crossed himself before taking a bite. But when Tanaka tasted the coffee, bitter and rich, he felt something snap inside him. For the first time in years, he was eating without fear. The guards stood nearby, talking quietly among themselves. One laughed about a baseball game in Houston. Another teased a friend about his slow draw. To Tanaka, it felt unreal. The men who had shot down his comrades only months earlier now chatted like neighbors on a Sunday morning. After dinner, the prisoners were escorted to the yard for orientation. A lieutenant explained the camp rules. No violence, no escape attempts, respect for property, and everyone would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. "You work, you eat, you rest," he said. "You cause trouble, you lose privileges, but no one here is interested in cruelty. Understood?" The PS nodded, uncertain. Tanaka studied the officer's face. There was authority but no hatred. The man ended with something even stranger. "You help us, we'll help you. That's how America works." Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tanaka stood outside the barracks, staring at the vast Texas sky. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Orange fading into violet, stars beginning to burn through the twilight. In Japan, Skies were crowded with smoke and fear. Here, they seemed to stretch forever. He thought about his homeland, the ration lines, the bombed-out cities, the propaganda posters showing Americans as beasts. Yet these beasts offered food, shelter, and dignity to their enemies. Tanaka felt a strange mix of shame and admiration. He wondered if this was what real power looked like, not domination but restraint. Before lights out, an American guard passed by and stopped near Tanaka. "First day is the hardest," the man said, lighting a cigarette. "Tomorrow you'll get used to it," Tanaka asked quietly. "Used to what?" The guard exhaled smoke and smiled. "Freedom, I guess." The words lingered long after the lights went out. Tanaka lay on his bunk, listening to the faint sounds of crickets outside. In that moment, he realized something profound. Captivity in America didn't feel like punishment. It felt like an invitation to understand something far larger than war. He wrote in his diary that night, "If this is defeat, it is the strangest kind I've ever known." A week after settling into Camp Borden, Tanaka's group received unexpected orders. They would be transferred outside the wire for agricultural duty. The guards explained little, only that the work was voluntary and supervised. Some prisoners were suspicious, imagining hard labor in the scorching Texas sun. Others, starved for any sense of purpose, signed up immediately. Tanaka volunteered without hesitation. At dawn, army trucks carried them across rolling fields and open plains. The landscape was a revelation. Endless stretches of grass and cattle under a sky so wide it made every man feel small. When they stopped at a sprawling ranch north of San Angelo, Tanaka saw men in wide-brimmed hats waiting by a corral. They weren't soldiers, they were cowboys. The ranch owner, a leathery man named Henry Collins, stepped forward, shaking hands with the army lieutenant. "These the fellas?" he asked, glancing over the group. The lieutenant nodded. Collins studied the Japanese prisoners for a long moment, then said, "All right then, boys. We got fences to mend and cattle to feed. You work hard, you'll eat well. You slack off, you'll still eat, but I'll be disappointed. Let's keep it simple." The tone wasn't cruel, just straightforward. It reminded Tanaka of his old flight instructor, stern but fair. The cowboys demonstrated how to handle feed bags, patch wire, and move herds without startling them. The PS watched carefully, mimicking each motion with precision. Years of military discipline made them efficient learners. By noon, sweat soaked their uniforms, but when Collins brought out a cooler filled with water and tin cups, no one refused. He poured for each man himself. "Don't let the sun fool you," he said, grinning. "Texas will cook you slow if you're not careful." Tanaka drank deeply. The water was cool, shockingly clean, tasting faintly of minerals and earth. It struck him that this American, this supposed enemy, had just served him like a guest. Over the next weeks, the rhythm became familiar. Sunrise work, midday rest, evening meals under the open sky. The guards were present but relaxed, rifles slung behind their backs. The cowboys treated the peers with a kind of cautious respect, judging them not by nationality but by effort. When one man broke a plow blade, the ranch foreman didn't yell. He simply sighed and said, "Guess you'll learn to fix it then." Something began to shift inside the prisoners. Work that had once been forced now became voluntary. Some started humming Japanese songs while stacking hay. Others learned a few English phrases. "Water, good job, thank you." The cowboys laughed at their accents, but it was never mocking. The barriers that war had built began to crumble under the Texas sun. One evening, as the men rested near the fence line, Collins approached Tanaka. "You flew planes, right?" he asked. Tanaka nodded. Collins looked toward the horizon. "My son's over in France. Flies. For the army I roar. Maybe one day you two would have met up there trying to shoot each other down," Tanaka said softly. "Perhaps." Collins chuckled. "Well, I like this version better. Cheaper on the planes." They both laughed quietly. For Tanaka, that moment was more powerful than any sermon or speech. Here was an enemy's father, sharing humor instead of hatred. When the workday ended, Collins clapped his hands. "Supper time. Let's eat before the coyotes get bold." The cowboys shared food from their mess table, beans, cornbread, and bacon. The prisoners hesitated, but the guards nodded approval. Tanaka took a strip of bacon, its salty aroma filling his nose. He chewed slowly, his eyes stinging with unexpected emotion. That night, under a dome of stars, Tanaka wrote in his journal, "They call us prisoners, but I think we are students. This land, these people, they are teaching us the meaning of strength without cruelty." Back at Camp Borden, word spread quickly about the ranch detail. The Japanese prisoners returned leaner, tanned, and oddly changed. They spoke about cowboys who shook their hands, about working without guards hovering over them, about being treated as equals under the same Texas sky. For men raised on the code of Bushido, where mercy was weakness and surrender dishonor, it didn't add up. The math of war had broken. Tanaka began to see the pattern. In Japan, every equation was one of control, command and obedience, loyalty and punishment. In America, the system ran on trust, on the invisible strength of assuming that others would do what was right when given the chance. It was the same logic that allowed the Americans to hand prisoners tools, to let them roam open fields, to build an empire of production powered by ordinary men and women who were never threatened, only believed in. The efficiency of American abundance wasn't luck. It was trust industrialized. Every soldier, every worker, every ranch hand was part of a machine that didn't need constant supervision. That freedom created an output no tyranny could match. Tanaka observed it everywhere. The guards didn't count every spoon or monitor every conversation. They trusted systems, not individuals. The meals arrived on time. The mail was sorted without delay. The Red Cross delivered packages with near scientific precision. It was all so smooth, so stable that it frightened him. He realized how fragile Japan's war effort had been, built on obedience and fear, both of which demanded constant energy to maintain. One evening, Tanaka and his bunkmate Corporal Sato discussed it quietly. "They fight differently," Sato said, staring at the ceiling. "They believe in each other too much. It makes them dangerous." Tanaka nodded. "In our army, if one man fails, he is shamed. In theirs, if one man fails, another helps him. It is not shame. They call it teamwork." Sato frowned. "And we call them soft." Tanaka smiled faintly. "Soft things bend, hard things break." Over the next months, the trust experiment deepened. The prisoners worked on larger ranches, sometimes unsupervised for hours. No one tried to escape. Even when trucks carried them through open countryside, not a single man made a run for the horizon. Where would they go? To a war that no longer made sense, to a homeland that might already be ashes. The Americans noticed. Camp commanders filed reports praising the Japanese workers' discipline and cooperation. The Army's own evaluations noted a remarkable willingness to adapt. What none of those reports captured was the deeper exchange taking place, an unspoken education in what power truly meant. For Tanaka, the revelation was personal. He had once believed that victory came from strength of will, the harder nation, the more disciplined soldier, the unbending code. But here, under the Texas sun, he saw a new equation. Strength multiplied by compassion, order plus freedom, discipline divided by cruelty. The math of America worked differently, and it worked better. When letters from Japan arrived through the Red Cross, the prisoners read them in silence. Families spoke of food shortages, bombings, despair. Tanaka folded each letter carefully, feeling the weight of two worlds, one collapsing from rigidity, the other thriving through openness. He began to teach English phrases to other prisoners, translating ranch instructions, writing them on scraps of paper. He wasn't serving as captives. He was trying to understand them. Because somewhere between the fences and the fields, he'd realized that the war wasn't just about guns and planes. It was about two civilizations, one chained by obedience and another liberated by trust. As summer deepened, Tanaka wrote in his diary, "We built our empire on fear. They built theirs on faith. Now I see which one survives the longer war." December in Texas came cold and dry, the kind of chill that bit through the thin fabric of the prisoners' uniforms, but couldn't quite suppress the warmth that had grown between captives and cowboys. The ranch fields were quiet now, the cattle fattened, the fences mended. For the first time in years, Tanaka felt the season of peace approaching. Not as a propaganda slogan, but as something tangible, a calmness that settled over the camp like snow that never fell. Then came the rumor. The guards were talking about something special for Christmas. No one knew what it meant. Some assumed it was for the Americans alone, perhaps a party they'd watch from behind the fence. Others joked that maybe the guards would let them sing if they behaved. But on the morning of December 24th, everything changed. The trucks came early, loaded with sacks of potatoes, crates of canned goods, and even a barrel of something sweet that smelled like syrup and smoke. Sergeant Dalton, the same guard who had worked the ranch details, shouted, "All hands, let's get the tables set. Today, nobody's a prisoner." The men stared at him, uncomprehending. "No work today," he clarified, grinning. "Just food. It's Christmas." By noon, the mess yard had transformed. Long wooden tables lined with tin plates, an American flag overhead, and most surreal of all, music. One of the guards had brought a portable record player, and Bing Crosby's voice drifted through the air. "I'm dreaming of a white Christmas for Tanaka, who had spent holidays crouched in air raid shelters." The sound was almost unbearable. Not because it hurt, but because it healed. The cowboys and guards moved among the prisoners, serving steaming trays of roast beef, mashed potatoes, biscuits, and something no Japanese man had ever tasted before: cranberry sauce. The color gleamed like rubies against the dull metal plates. As they ate, laughter broke out, awkward at first, then genuine. One cowboy raised a tin mug of coffee and said, "To peace, may we all get home someday." A few of the PS hesitated, then raised their cups too. Tanaka joined them. It was a gesture small enough to escape notice, but in that instant, decades of hate cracked open. Midway through the meal, one of the American cooks rolled out a surprise: a small cake frosted with white sugar. "Baked special," he said proudly. "Didn't think y'all had cake in Japan." Tanaka couldn't help but laugh. "Not like this," he replied in halting English. "Too beautiful to eat." "Eat anyway," the cook said, handing him a slice. When the sun began to set, the camp grew quiet again. Someone started singing softly, an old German carol that one of the Japanese men had learned while studying abroad before the war. The Americans listened, then joined in with their own hymn. Different words, different melodies, but somehow they fit together. Two broken nations finding harmony for a single night. Later, as Tanaka walked back to the barracks, he passed Sergeant Dalton sitting by a small fire, whittling a piece of wood. The Texan looked up. "Never thought I'd share Christmas dinner with a Japanese pilot," he said. Tanaka bowed slightly. "Never thought I'd share peace with a cowboy." Dalton smiled. "Guess the world's full of surprises." That night, lying in his bunk, Tanaka wrote his longest diary entry yet. "They fed us not to show power, but to show peace. They celebrate even in war. Maybe that's how they win. Not just on the battlefield, but in the soul." He looked at his hands, calloused from work, but steadied now by something else. Understanding. The war had taken his comrades, his aircraft, his pride, but in a Texas camp, over coffee and song, it had given him back his humanity. Spring came to Texas like a slow miracle. The frost melted, the grass grew tall again, and the war, though still raging oceans away, seemed to fade with every sunrise over the plains. The guards loosened rules. The PWs began working further out on the ranches, trusted to handle the animals and tools as if they belonged there. Then one Saturday morning, Sergeant Dalton gathered the men and grinned. "Boys, we're going to a rodeo." The word meant nothing to the Japanese prisoners. Tanaka tilted his head. "Rodo?" Dalton laughed. "You'll see. It's where we let the bulls try to kill us for fun." The PS looked horrified. "Don't worry," Dalton added. "We don't usually die." They were trucked to a local fairground, a broad dirt arena surrounded by bleachers. Cowboys in checkered shirts and boots were tightening saddles and stretching ropes. The air smelled of dust, hay, and excitement. A brass band played somewhere near the entrance. When the PWs were led to their seats, local families turned to stare for a tense moment and knock a brace for hostility, but instead a woman handed her young son a paper cup of lemonade and whispered, "Go give one to those fellas too." The boy hesitated, then trotted over, offering drinks to men his country had once called monsters. Tanaka bowed and accepted it, his throat tightening. The announcer's voice crackled through the loudspeaker. "Welcome, folks, to the Abilene Charity Rodeo. Let's raise some money for the Red Cross." The crowd erupted in cheers. The events began. Bucking broncos, steer roping, barrel races. Each time a cowboy stayed on a bull for more than 8 seconds. The stands thundered. The POWs were mesmerized. They had seen war horses and machine discipline. But this chaos controlled by courage was unlike anything in their culture. Dalton sat beside Tanaka explaining the events. "It's about holding on," he said. "Doesn't matter how rough it gets, just hold till the whistle." Tanaka nodded slowly. "Like life." Halfway through, the announcer surprised everyone. "Next, the charity ride. Volunteers welcome." Dalton turned to the prisoners. "Any of you brave enough?" he teased. The men laughed nervously, shaking their heads, but one, a wiry mechanic named Fujioto, raised his hand. "I ride," he said in broken English. The crowd murmured. The announcer grinned. "Ladies and gentlemen, our next rider is a Japanese prisoner of war." The arena went dead silent. Fujimoto stepped forward, small against the massive brown horse snorting beneath him. Dalton adjusted the stirrups, whispering, "Hold tight, buddy." When the gate opened, chaos exploded. The horse bucked, twisting violently. Fujimoto clung on, teeth gritted, face contorted, but he didn't fall. 8 seconds passed, then 10. When the whistle blew, the crowd erupted. The cheers were not polite, they were thunderous. American flags waved, hats flew into the air. Fujimoto staggered off, shaking, stunned by the applause. A little girl ran down from the stands, handing him a ribbon. "You're brave," she said. He bowed deeply, eyes shining with tears. Dalton clapped him on the back. "Guess that makes you a cowboy now." That night, back in camp, the prisoners couldn't stop talking. For the first time since the war began, they'd been celebrated not as soldiers, but as men. The humiliation of defeat was replaced briefly, powerfully, by the respect of equals. Tanaka wrote in his diary, "They cheer courage even in their enemy. They fight with honor, but their honor is joy, not death. We built our pride on silence. They build theirs on laughter. Maybe that's the stronger way." As lights went out, a few men hummed the rodeo band's tune softly in the dark. The melody drifted over the barracks like a promise, one that said the world could be rebuilt not through vengeance, but through understanding. By summer's end, the war was over. The guards at Camp Borden gathered the prisoners one morning under the glaring Texas sun. A radio sat on a folding table, its static breaking the silence before the announcer's voice came through. "The Emperor of Japan has accepted unconditional surrender. The war is finished." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Tanaka heard a sound he couldn't name, half sob, half sigh. It came from his own chest. The men around him lowered their heads, some weeping, others staring at the dust. Across the fence, the Americans stood quietly, hats in hand. There was no gloating, no shouting, no talk of victory, just stillness. That night, the prisoners sat in the mess hall, uneaten food cooling on their plates. Tanaka stared at the coffee before him. The same bitter, dark drink he had once refused to touch. Now it tasted like reality. Sergeant Dalton entered with 2 officers carrying a small wooden box. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "for you to take home." Inside were photographs, snapshots taken during the months of ranch work, prisoners on horseback, men laughing at the rodeo. Tanaka helping a cowboy fix a fence. Each image was stamped, Camp Borden, Texas, 1945. "Why?" Tanaka asked in halting English. "Why you give us this?" Dalton shrugged. "Because one day when you go home, people will ask what America was like, and I'd rather you tell them the truth." That night, Tanaka couldn't sleep. The camp was silent, except for the soft clanging of a distant gate. He opened his diary and wrote his final entry. "They defeated us without hate. They destroyed our weapons but rebuilt our souls. Their victory was not just of arms, but of hearts." He thought of the rodeo cheers, the Christmas meal, the trust of the open range. None of it had been strategy, and yet it had achieved what no bullet could. It had rewritten the enemy's mind. When morning came, trucks lined up to transport the men to the port of Galveston for repatriation. The guards shook hands with each departing prisoner. When Tanaka's turn came, Dalton handed him something wrapped in cloth. "For luck," he said. Tanaka unwrapped it. A small silver horseshoe pendant tied to a leather string. He didn't know what to say. I will keep, he whispered. As the truck rolled away, he looked back at the camp, its white fences, the barracks, the dust trails curling like smoke behind the tires. He realized that this place meant to confine him had instead freed him from everything he thought he knew about strength. Years later, when interviewed for a Japanese newspaper, Tanaka told his stories. They taught us that mercy is not weakness, he said. They showed us that a nation can be powerful without cruelty, proud without hatred. We believed that fear made soldiers brave. We were wrong. Kindness did. Historians would later call America's prisoner of war system the Quiet Front, a campaign of civility that dismantled the ideology of its enemies more effectively than any weapon. But for Tanaka, it was simpler. They fed us, they listened, they let us live like men again. That was enough. The war's arithmetic had been rewritten, not strength minus compassion, but strength multiplied by it. Not command and obedience, but trust and respect. That was the equation that ended empires. And so when Tanaka's ship approached Yokohama harbor weeks later, he stood on deck, clutching the horseshoe, and whispered the words he had first thought in that Texas field. We lost not to their guns, but to their grace. As the story of Japan's prisoners faded into the archives, the lessons they carried home endured. Men like Lieutenant Tanaka returned to a shattered empire with something their nation had never taught them, a vision of strength built not on domination, but on decency. They had been warriors once, trained to fight until death. Yet in the wide plains of Texas among cowboys and campfires, they discovered that the greatest victory didn't come from killing, but from kindness. Years later, when asked what America's secret weapon was, Tanaka smiled and answered without hesitation. It wasn't their planes or their guns, it was their hearts. That quote would appear decades later in a Japanese school textbook under the section titled Humanity in War. In the war of machines and ideologies, America's quietest power had been its mercy, an engine of goodwill that broke hatred faster than bombs could destroy cities. And as the camera pans over the endless Texas horizon, the narrator's final words echo like a closing prayer. They came to America as enemies. They left as witnesses because sometimes the most powerful act in war is choosing to be human. Fade to silence.